A marriage built on a bet. A life saved by a wife who refused to look away. Clara Whitmore became a bride for $50, the exact amount her father owed the bank. Her groom? A deaf rancher who lived alone, spoke to no one, and suffered in silence. She discovered the truth on her wedding night. Their marriage was the result of a wager. Elias Boone hadn't chosen her. He'd been dared to marry her. But when Clara found something alive inside her husband's skull, something that had been feeding on him for 25 years, everything changed. Welcome to this story. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this tale travels. And if this story moves you, don't forget to hit that like button. Now, let's begin. The morning Clara Whitmore became a bride, snow fell in fat, lazy flakes over the Montana Territory, coating the rutted streets of Sweetwater in a silence that felt like mourning. She stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom, smoothing the front of her mother's wedding dress. Yellowed lace, too loose in the bodice, smelling faintly of camphor and regret. Her hands trembled as she fastened the pewter buttons, not from cold, not from nerves, from shame. Clara. Her father's voice came through the thin wooden door, hoarse and careful. It's time. She closed her eyes, breathed in through her nose, exhaled slowly. I'm ready, she lied. The truth was simpler and uglier than any fairy tale. Clara Whitmore, 23 years old, educated in a boarding school back east until the money ran out, was being sold. Not in those words, of course. Her father called it an arrangement. Her brother called it practical. The banker who held the deed to their house called it a solution. Clara called it what it was, $50. That's what she was worth? $50 to keep the roof over her father's head. $50 to buy her brother another season before he'd have to find work that didn't involve drinking away his wages. $50 to marry a man she'd never spoken to, who lived miles outside town, who was known throughout Sweetwater for exactly two things. He owned good land, and he never said a word to anyone. Elias Boone, 38 years old, deaf since childhood, reclusive to the point of legend. Clara had seen him exactly twice in her life. Once, 3 years ago, when he'd come into town for supplies and she'd watched him from the window of the general store. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving through the crowd like a ghost, eyes down, hat pulled low. No one spoke to him. No one tried. The second time was last week, when her father brought him to the house. Elias had stood in their cramped parlor, snow melting off his boots onto the warped floorboards, and looked at her with dark, unreadable eyes. He hadn't smiled, hadn't nodded, hadn't done anything that suggested he wanted this any more than she did. Her father had done all the talking. My daughter's a hard worker, Mr. Boone. Good with numbers, keeps a clean house. She'll be a credit to you, I promise you that. Elias had glanced at Clara once, just once. Then he'd pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, scrawled something with a pencil stub, and handed it to her father. Agreement accepted. Wedding Saturday. That was it. No courtship, no conversation, no pretense that this was anything other than a transaction. Now, as Clara descended the narrow stairs, holding her skirts to keep from tripping, she felt the weight of that transaction settle over her shoulders like a yoke. Her father waited at the bottom, dressed in his one good suit, the collar frayed, the cuffs stained. His face was gray, deep lines carved around his mouth. He looked 10 years older than he had before her mother died. You look beautiful, he said quietly. Clara didn't answer. Beautiful wasn't the point. Useful was the point. Cheap enough to afford was the point. They walked the 3 blocks to the church in silence. Her father's arm linked through hers, her brother trailing behind, reeking of whiskey even at 9 in the morning. The streets were nearly empty, a few shopkeepers sweeping snow from their doorsteps. A wagon rattling past, the driver hunched against the cold. No one looked at her. No one waved. Clara had the sudden, bitter thought that she was already disappearing, already becoming the woman who married the deaf rancher and vanished into the hills. The church was small, drafty, smelling of damp wood and old hymnals. Reverend Michaels waited near the altar, his expression carefully neutral. Elias stood beside him, dressed in a dark suit that looked stiff and uncomfortable, his hat in his hands. He didn't turn when she entered. Clara's father walked her down the short aisle, his grip tight on her arm, and when they reached the front, he pressed her hand into Elias's without a word. Elias's palm was warm, calloused, rough as tree bark. He still didn't look at her. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. Reverend Michaels spoke the words quickly, as though embarrassed by the whole affair. Clara repeated her vows in a voice that didn't sound like hers. Elias, of course, said nothing. He simply nodded when prompted, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere over the Reverend's shoulder. "You may kiss the bride." Elias hesitated. For a long, terrible moment, Clara thought he might refuse. Then he leaned down, brushed his lips against her cheek, quick, perfunctory, cold, and stepped back. "Congratulations," Reverend Michaels said, though his tone suggested condolences might be more appropriate. Clara's father shook Elias's hand. Her brother didn't bother. He was already halfway out the door, probably heading for the saloon. And just like that, it was done. She was married. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours. Elias drove the wagon in silence, his shoulders hunched against the wind, his eyes on the road. Clara sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her mother's wedding dress already dusted with snow. She tried to look at him without being obvious about it, tried to see past the silence, the stillness, the walls he'd built around himself. He wasn't handsome exactly. His face was too weathered, too hard, carved from years of work and isolation. But there was something in the set of his mouth, the line of his jaw, that suggested he hadn't always been this way. That somewhere, beneath the silence, there was a man who'd once known how to smile. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. The ranch appeared as the sun began to set. A low, sturdy cabin set against a stand of pines, smoke rising from the chimney, a barn and corral to one side. Simple. Isolated. Exactly what she'd expected. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop, climbed down, and extended a hand to help her. Clara took it, stepped into the snow, and looked around. No neighbors, no lights in the distance, just trees, mountains, and sky. She was alone with a stranger. Elias led her inside without ceremony. The cabin was neat, almost austere. One main room with a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen area. A door to what she assumed was a bedroom stood half open on the far wall. Elias set her small trunk down by the door, then pulled out his notebook again. "You can have the bedroom. I'll sleep out here." Clara read the words, then looked up at him. "That's not necessary." He shook his head, wrote again. "It's already arranged." She wanted to argue, wanted to say something about dignity, about not being a burden. But the truth was, she was relieved. The idea of sharing a bed with a stranger, this stranger, made her stomach twist. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Elias nodded once, then turned and began building up the fire. Clara stood there for a moment, feeling the strangeness of it all settle over her like the snow outside. Then she picked up her trunk and carried it into the bedroom. It was small but clean, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a single window looking out onto the pines. She set the trunk down, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally let herself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears that slid down her cheeks and dripped onto her mother's wedding dress, leaving dark spots on the yellowed lace. She cried for the life she'd imagined and lost, for the future that had been sold for $50, for the loneliness that stretched out before her like the Montana winter, cold, endless, unforgiving. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood, and began unpacking, because there was nothing else to do. Whoa. The first week passed in a kind of numb routine. Elias woke before dawn, dressed quietly, and disappeared into the barn or the fields. Clara cooked meals he ate without comment, washed dishes in silence, swept floors that didn't need sweeping. They existed in the same space, but never quite together, like 2 strangers sheltering from the same storm. He communicated through his notebook. Short, functional sentences. Stew for supper. Need firewood chopped. Storm coming. Clara wrote back sometimes, but mostly she just nodded. It seemed easier. She tried not to think about the life she'd left behind. Tried not to miss the boarding house where she'd lived after school, the bookshop where she'd worked, The friends who'd written letters that grew less frequent as the months passed, tried not to feel like a ghost haunting her own life. But on the 8th night, something changed. Clara woke to a sound she couldn't place. A low, choked noise, barely audible through the thin wall between the bedroom and the main room. She sat up, heart pounding, and listened. There it was again. A groan, rough, pained. She threw back the quilt, pulled on her robe, and opened the door. Elias was on the floor near the fireplace, one hand pressed to the side of his head, his face twisted in agony. His notebook lay open beside him, the pencil rolled into the shadows. Clara's breath caught. Elias. He didn't hear her, of course, didn't even know she was there. She crossed the room quickly, knelt beside him, and touched his shoulder. He flinched, jerked away, then saw her and went still. His eyes were dark with pain, his breathing shallow. Clara pointed to his head, then to herself, trying to ask without words, "What's wrong? Can I help?" Elias closed his eyes, shook his head slowly. He reached for the notebook with a trembling hand, scrawled something barely legible. Happens sometimes. It passes. Clara read the words, then looked at him. Really looked. His face was pale, slick with sweat. His hand shook as he pressed it against his skull. This wasn't something small. This wasn't something that just passed. She stood, went to the kitchen, soaked a cloth in cool water and brought it back, knelt beside him again, and pressed it gently to his forehead. Elias opened his eyes, stared at her with something that might have been surprise, or suspicion, or both. But he didn't pull away. Clara stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, holding the cloth to his skin, until the tension in his shoulders began to ease, until his breathing slowed, until he finally let his hand drop. When he reached for the notebook again, his handwriting was steadier. "Thank you." Clara nodded. Didn't say she was welcome. Didn't say anything. But something shifted between them in that moment. Something small and fragile. The first crack in the wall. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara began to notice things. The way Elias sometimes pressed his palm to the right side of his head when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he moved carefully in the mornings, as though every step hurt. The faint smudges on his pillow, stains she realized with growing unease, were blood. He never mentioned it, never wrote about it. But she saw, and she started to ask questions. One evening, after supper, she pointed to his head and wrote in his notebook, "How long have you had the headaches?" Elias read it, hesitated, then wrote back, "Since I was a boy." "Always?" He nodded. "Have you seen a doctor?" "Yes." "Many times. They say it's connected to my hearing. Nothing to be done." Clara frowned, wrote again, "Do you believe them?" Elias looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he wrote one word, "No." That night, Clara lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking. A lifetime of pain. A lifetime of doctors who dismissed him. A lifetime of suffering he'd learned to carry alone because no one believed him. She thought about her own loneliness, her own invisibility. The way people looked through her, past her, as though she didn't matter. And she made a decision. If no one else would help him, she would. The collapse happened 3 nights later. Clara had just finished washing the supper dishes when she heard the crash. She spun around to find Elias on the floor, convulsing, one hand clawing at the side of his head, his face contorted in agony. The chair he'd been sitting in had toppled, the notebook skittering across the floor. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She dropped to her knees beside him, grabbed his shoulders, tried to steady him. "Elias, Elias, look at me!" But his eyes were squeezed shut, his teeth clenched, his entire body rigid with pain. She'd never seen anything like it. Terror clawed at her throat, but she forced it down, forced herself to think. His head. Always his head. Always the right side. She grabbed the lamp from the table, held it close, and gently turned his face toward the light. His ear. She'd never looked closely before. Never had reason to. But now, with the lamplight falling across his skin, she saw it. A faint darkness deep inside the canal. A shadow that didn't belong. Her breath caught. Something's in there. The thought was absurd, impossible. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became. There was something inside Elias's ear. something that moved. Her stomach turned, but she didn't look away. Elias's breathing had slowed, the convulsions easing into exhausted trembling. He opened his eyes, saw her hovering over him, and tried to sit up. Clara pressed a hand to his chest, shook her head, pointed to his ear, then to the lamp, trying to make him understand. "I need to look. Let me look." Elias stared at her, confusion and pain warring in his expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. Clara's hand shook as she adjusted the lamp, angling the light directly into his ear canal. She leaned closer, squinting, trying to see past the dried blood and shadow. And then it moved. A flicker. A twitch. Something alive, burrowing deeper. Clara's breath left her in a rush. She pulled back, heart hammering, and stared at Elias. He watched her, waiting, his face pale and drawn. She grabbed the notebook, wrote with trembling fingers, "There's something inside your ear, something alive." Elias read the words. For a moment, he didn't react. Then his hand rose slowly to the side of his head, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. Realization. He wrote back, his handwriting sharp and angry. "They told me I was imagining it." Clara's throat tightened. She thought of all those doctors, all those years, all that suffering dismissed as delusion. She thought of the $50 bet that had made her his wife. And she thought, enough. She stood, went to the kitchen, and began gathering supplies. A bowl of water, clean cloths, a pair of sewing tweezers she'd brought from home. Elias struggled to sit up, watching her with wide eyes. He reached for the notebook again. "What are you doing?" Clara didn't write back. She just knelt beside him, set the supplies down, and met his gaze. Then she pointed to his ear, pointed to the tweezers, pointed to herself. "I'm going to get it out." Elias's eyes widened. He shook his head violently, grabbed her wrist. "No. Too dangerous. You'll—" Clara pulled her hand free, wrote one sentence. "Do you trust me?" Elias stared at the words, at her. For a long, terrible moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then slowly he nodded. Clara's hand steadied. She dipped the tweezers in the bowl, held them over the lamp flame for a moment, then looked at Elias. "Lie still," she said, even though she knew he couldn't hear. "This is going to hurt." She positioned the lamp as close as she dared, leaned in, and inserted the tweezers into his ear canal. Elias went rigid, his hand clamping down on her knee, his breathing harsh and ragged. Clara ignored the pressure, the fear, the voice in her head screaming that she had no idea what she was doing. She focused on the shadow, on the movement, on the thing that had been stealing his life for 25 years. The tweezers touched something solid, something that twitched. Clara's stomach lurched, but she didn't stop. She adjusted her grip, felt the resistance, and pulled. Slowly, carefully. And then it came free. A centipede, 3 inches long. Blood-slicked and writhing, segmented legs clawing at the air. Clara jerked back, dropping it into the bowl, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elias sat up, stared at the bowl, and made a sound Clara had never heard before. A sob, raw and broken, and filled with something that might have been relief, or grief, or both. He covered his face with his hands and wept. Clara set the tweezers down, wrapped her arms around him, and held on. And for the first time since their wedding, she didn't feel like payment. She felt like a wife. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low, watching the centipede's corpse curl in the bottom of the bowl. Even dead, it seemed impossible. A thing pulled from nightmares, not from human flesh. She'd dropped it into whiskey after Elias finally released her, needing to preserve it, needing proof that what she'd seen was real. Because if she didn't have proof, she'd wonder if exhaustion had conjured it whole. Elias had retreated to the bedroom after his tears stopped, his hand pressed to his ear, his face still pale with shock. Clara had wanted to follow, to check the wound, to make sure she hadn't done more harm than good. But something in the set of his shoulders told her he needed to be alone. So she waited. The fire burned down to embers. Snow began falling again outside, soft and steady. And Clara sat with the evidence of 25 years of suffering floating in a bowl of liquor, wondering what kind of doctors had looked at a child's pain and called it imagination, wondering what else they'd been wrong about. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, Clara heard movement from the bedroom. She stood quickly, smoothing her skirts, suddenly uncertain. What did you say to a man whose skull you'd just invaded? Whose private agony you'd witnessed? Elias emerged slowly, moving like someone testing new ground. He'd changed his shirt, washed his face. The right side of his head was swollen, the ear red and crusted with dried blood. But his eyes were different, clearer, sharper, like he'd been looking through fog for years and it had suddenly lifted. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze dropping to the bowl on the table, to the thing inside. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Elias crossed the room, picked up his notebook, and wrote with hands that trembled slightly. Is it real? Clara nodded. It's real. He stared at the centipede, his jaw working, his throat convulsing like he was trying not to be sick. Then he wrote again, the letters pressed so hard they nearly tore the paper. 25 years. I know, Clara said softly. They told me I was broken, that the pain was in my head. He underlined the last 3 words twice. They made me believe them. Clara's chest tightened. She reached out, touched his hand where it gripped the pencil. You weren't broken. You were suffering. There's a difference. Elias looked at her then, really looked, and something in his expression cracked open. Not relief, something raw. Something that looked like grief for all the years he'd spent believing he was beyond help. He wrote again, slower this time. How did you know? I didn't, Clara admitted. Not for certain, but I saw the way you moved. The blood, the way the pain came in waves. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And I saw the way no one else looked. Not your neighbors, not the reverend, not even the doctors who were supposed to help you. You looked. Yes. Why? The question hung between them, simple and enormous. Clara thought about the $50. The crumpled note she'd found in the barn the day after their wedding, tucked behind a toolbox where Elias probably thought no one would find it. Her brother's handwriting, rough and mocking. $50 says he won't go through with it. Deaf bastards too scared of women. She'd burned the note. Burned it and never mentioned it because what good would it do? The marriage was done, the money spent, the damage already complete. But standing here now, looking at Elias's waiting expression, Clara realized something had shifted. The bet didn't matter anymore, not the way it had. Because you're my husband, she said quietly, and because suffering shouldn't be invisible just because it's quiet. Elias stared at her. Then he set the notebook down, raised his hand and touched his fingers to his temple in what Clara thought might be a gesture of respect. Or thanks. Or maybe both. When he picked up the pencil again, his handwriting was steadier. The pain is less. Not gone, but less. That's good, Clara said, though her relief was tempered with worry. But the wound needs care, proper care. We should... She stopped. Elias was shaking his head, already writing. No doctors. Elias, no doctors. They had their chance. I won't give them another. Clara understood the anger, even shared it, but infection didn't care about pride. Then let me tend it. I've read medical texts. I know how to... Elias's hand shot out, caught her wrist, not roughly, but firmly. His eyes held hers, and she saw the fear there, buried beneath the stubbornness. He was terrified of being dismissed again, of having someone else tell him his pain didn't matter. Clara turned her hand in his grip, squeezed his fingers. I won't hurt you, she said, and I won't stop believing you, but that wound could kill you if it gets infected. Please, let me help. For a moment she thought he'd refuse. Then, slowly, he nodded. Clara exhaled. All right, sit down. Let me see. The next hour tested both of them. Clara boiled water, tore clean cloth into strips, mixed a paste of honey and yarrow she'd found in the small herb garden behind the cabin. Elias sat rigid in the chair, his hands clenched on his thighs, his breathing carefully controlled. When Clara finally examined his ear in full daylight, she had to swallow back nausea. The canal was inflamed, swollen nearly shut, streaked with blood, and something that might have been pus. The centipede had done damage, years of it, burrowing and feeding. This is going to hurt, she warned, even though he couldn't hear. Then she began to clean. Elias went white. Sweat broke out across his forehead. But he didn't pull away, didn't flinch. He just closed his eyes and endured. Clara worked as gently as she could, dabbing away blood and debris, applying the honey paste, wrapping his head in clean bandages. Her hands shook, her stomach churned. But she didn't stop. When she finally finished, Elias opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe. Or something deeper. Something that made her heart beat faster. He reached for the notebook. "Thank you." Clara wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how close they were, how intimate this all was. His blood on her fingers, her breath on his skin. "You're welcome. I need to ask you something." "All right." Elias hesitated, the pencil hovering over the paper. Then he wrote quickly, as though forcing the words out before he could reconsider. "Did you know about the bet?" Clara's breath caught. She stared at the words, her mind racing. She could lie. Tell him she'd never seen the note, never knew her brother had wagered $50, that Elias was too broken to marry. But she was tired of lies, tired of pretending. "Yes," she said quietly. "I found the note, the day after our wedding." Elias's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went dark. He wrote again, the letters sharp. "And you stayed." "Where else would I go?" Clara's voice came out harsher than she intended. "My family sold me for $50 to keep their house. You think I had choices?" Elias flinched, wrote quickly. "I didn't know about the bet. Not until after. Your brother told me the day we brought you home. He was drunk. Thought it was funny." Clara's hands curled into fists. "Of course he did. I wanted to tell you, to explain, but I didn't know how." Elias paused, then added, "I'm sorry." "You're sorry?" Clara shook her head, anger flaring hot in her chest. "You're not the one who should be sorry. They are. My father, my brother, the people who thought our lives were something to gamble with. I could have refused, could have said no. But you didn't." Clara's voice softened. "Why?" Elias stared at the notebook for a long time. When he finally wrote, his handwriting was slow, deliberate. "Because I was tired of being alone. And because I thought maybe someone like you wouldn't expect much, wouldn't be disappointed when I couldn't give it." The words hit Clara like a fist. She thought of all the times she'd felt invisible, worthless, like the world had weighed her and found her wanting. And here was Elias thinking the exact same thing about himself. "I don't know what I expected," Clara said quietly. "But I know what I found. A man who's been suffering his whole life and still gets up every morning. Who keeps this place running even when the pain is so bad he can barely stand. That's not nothing, Elias. That's not worthless." Elias looked up at her, and for the first time since they'd met, Clara saw something like hope in his eyes. He wrote one word. "Stay." Not a command. A question. A plea. Clara thought about the life waiting for her back in Sweetwater. The father who'd sold her. The brother who'd mocked her husband. The empty rooms and emptier future. She thought about the centipede in the bowl. The blood on her hands. The way Elias had trusted her enough to let her reach inside his skull. "I'll stay," she said, and meant it. Over the next week, something fragile and tentative began to grow between them. Elias's ear healed slowly. Clara changed the bandages twice a day, checking for infection, applying fresh honey paste. The swelling began to recede. The redness faded. And Elias, for the first time in his life, began to sleep through the night. He still didn't speak. Couldn't speak, Clara assumed, after a lifetime of deafness. But his notes became longer. More personal. "I dreamed last night. Haven't remembered a dream in years. The chickens laid 4 eggs. I think they like you better than me. Your stew is better than mine. Don't let it go to your head." Clara found herself smiling as she read them, found herself writing back not just with answers, but with observations of her own. "The mare in the barn is pregnant. Did you know? I found your mother's quilt pattern in the trunk. It's beautiful. You should teach me to ride. I've never learned." The conversations were stilted, limited by paper and pencil, but they were conversations, real ones, the first either of them had had in longer than they could remember. And then, on the 8th day after the centipede, something changed. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread, when she heard a sound behind her, a sharp intake of breath. She turned to find Elias standing in the doorway, one hand pressed to his bandaged ear, his face pale. "What's wrong?" she asked, already reaching for a cloth. "Is it infected? Do you need—" "I heard you." Clara froze, stared at him. "What?" Elias's hand trembled against his ear. His voice, when he spoke again, was rough and uncertain, like someone testing a language they'd forgotten. "I heard you. Your voice. Just now." The bread dough slipped from Clara's fingers, landing on the table with a soft thud. "That's not possible." "I know." Elias took a step forward, his eyes wide. "But I heard it, faint, like listening through water. But I heard you." Clara's heart was hammering. She crossed the room quickly, pulled the bandage away, examined his ear. The canal was still swollen, still healing, but the inflammation had reduced significantly, and deep inside, where there had been only darkness before, she thought she saw light. "Say something," Elias said hoarsely. "Please, say anything." Clara's throat tightened. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Can you hear me?" Elias's eyes filled with tears. "Yes." Quiet. "But yes." "How is this possible?" "I don't know." He was trembling now, his breath coming fast and shallow. "The doctor said, they always said." "The doctors were wrong." Clara's voice came out fierce. "About the pain, about the centipede, about all of it." Elias pressed both hands to his face, and Clara realized he was crying. Not the broken sobs from the night she'd removed the creature. Something different, something closer to joy. She touched his shoulder and he grabbed her hand, held it tight. 25 years, he whispered. Gone. Just gone. Clara squeezed his fingers. Not gone. You survived them. That matters. Elias lowered his hands, looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. I don't know how to... His voice cracked. I don't remember how to hear, how to talk. It's been so long. Then we'll learn together, Clara said, slowly, however long it takes. Why? The word came out raw. Why would you do this for me? Clara thought about the answer, thought about all the reasons she could give, duty, obligation, gratitude for shelter and safety. But none of them felt true. Not anymore. Because you're not the only one who's been invisible, she said quietly, and because I'm tired of both of us living like ghosts. Elias stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. They stood there in the kitchen, flour dust hanging in the afternoon light, holding hands like children afraid of the dark. And for the first time since their wedding, Clara thought maybe, just maybe, this marriage might become something neither of them had expected. Something real. The changes came gradually over the following days. Elias's hearing sharpened. Sounds that had been muffled whispers became clearer. The clatter of dishes, the creak of floorboards, the wind against the windows. Each new sound seemed to startle him, pulling his attention like a child discovering the world for the first time. And his voice, unused for decades, began to strengthen. At first he spoke only in short bursts, single words, simple phrases. His vocal cords were weak, his pronunciation rough. But Clara was patient. She'd sit with him in the evenings, reading aloud from the few books she'd brought, watching him mouth the words silently, trying to remember how sound and speech connected. Tree, she'd say. Tuh, tree, he'd repeat, the word thick and unfamiliar on his tongue. Good. Again. Tree. It was painstaking work, frustrating for both of them. But Elias never gave up, and Clara never stopped encouraging him. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the centipede, Clara was washing dishes when Elias spoke from behind her. Clara. Just her name. But clear, steady. She turned, soap suds dripping from her hands, and found him watching her with an expression that made her chest tighten. You said it right, she whispered. I've been practicing. His voice was still rough, still hesitant, but it was his. Wanted to get it right. Your name. Clara's eyes burned. She wiped her hands on her apron, crossed to him. Say it again. Clara. He reached out, touched her cheek with tentative fingers. My wife. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Not payment, not burden. Wife. Clara covered his hand with hers. Elias. My husband. And when he leaned down and kissed her, really kissed her, not the quick cold brush from their wedding, Clara kissed him back. It was clumsy, uncertain, neither of them quite sure what they were doing, but it was real, honest. And when they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. I can hear your heartbeat, he whispered. It's fast. Clara laughed, the sound shaky. So is yours. They stood there, wrapped in each other, while the fire burned low and the Montana night pressed against the windows. And Clara thought, with a fierce, unexpected joy, that maybe being sold for $50 was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Because it had brought her here, to this man, to this moment, to the first real choice she'd made in years, to stay. But peace, Clara was learning, was a fragile thing. The knock came on a Tuesday morning, sharp and aggressive. Clara was hanging laundry when she heard it, the sound carrying clear across the yard. She turned to find Elias already moving toward the cabin, his hand instinctively rising to his ear, his shoulders tense. Clara dropped the wet shirt back in the basket and hurried after him. By the time she reached the door, Elias had already opened it. Her brother stood on the threshold, drunk despite the early hour, swaying slightly. Behind him, two other men from town, ranchers Clara recognized but had never spoken to, leaned against the porch railing, smirking. Well, well, her brother slurred. Look who's still here. Thought you'd have run off by now, Clara. Most women would have. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. What do you want, Thomas? Just checking on my investment. Thomas grinned, yellowed teeth flashing. Making sure old Boone here is treating you right. Wouldn't want that $50 to go to waste. Elias went rigid. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. One of the other men laughed. Heard he got his hearing back. That true, Boone? You actually listening now? Must be a miracle, Thomas said mockingly. Deaf bastard finally good for something. Clara stepped forward, putting herself between Elias and her brother. Get off our property. Now. Thomas's grin widened. Our property? Hell, Clara, you think because he can hear you now that makes this real? You're still just the girl we sold to keep the bank happy. And you're still the drunk who gambled on another man's misery, Clara shot back. How much did you lose, Thomas? When Elias married me anyway. Thomas's expression darkened. Watch your mouth. Or what? Clara's voice rose, all the anger she'd been swallowing for weeks pouring out. You'll take back your $50? You'll tell everyone in town how you bet your own sister's life? Go ahead. See how that goes for you. One of the men behind Thomas whistled low. She's got fire, Whitmore. Didn't know that when you sold her off? Shut up, Thomas snapped. He turned back to Clara, his eyes narrowed. You think you're better than us now, living out here with a freak who... He didn't finish. Elias's hand shot out, grabbed Thomas by the collar, and yanked him close. When he spoke, his voice was low and clear and utterly calm. Leave. Thomas's eyes widened. You can talk. I can talk, Elias said. I can hear. And I can throw you off my land if you don't walk away right now. The two men on the porch straightened, their smirks fading. One of them touched Thomas's arm. Come on, Whitmore, let's go. But Thomas jerked free, his face flushing red. You don't scare me, Boone. You're still the same pathetic... Elias shoved him, hard. Thomas stumbled backward, nearly fell, caught himself on the railing. For a moment Clara thought he might swing, might try to fight. But Elias just stood there, solid and immovable, his eyes dark with controlled fury. And Thomas, drunk and stupid as he was, seemed to realize he was outmatched. This isn't over, he spat. You can't just... It's over, Clara said quietly. You sold me. You made your choice. Now live with it. Thomas stared at her, something like hurt flickering across his face. Then he turned and stumbled down the porch steps, his companions following. Clara and Elias stood in the doorway, watching them go. Watching until they disappeared down the road, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence. Then Elias closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled slowly. I'm sorry, Clara said. I should have... Don't. Elias's voice was rough. Don't apologize for him. Apologize for them. They had no right. They never did. Elias pushed away from the door, looked at her with eyes that held both anger and something softer. But you stood up to them. For me? Of course I did. Why? Clara met his gaze. Because you're my husband, and because I meant what I said. This is our property, our life, and they don't get to take it from us. Elias crossed the room, took her face in his hands. You could leave. Go back to town, find a better man, a whole man. You are whole, Clara said fiercely. You're more whole than any of them, and I'm not going anywhere. Elias kissed her then, hard and desperate, like he was trying to prove something. To her, to himself, to the world that had tried to break them both. And Clara kissed him back, pouring every ounce of defiance and stubborn hope into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said quietly. Don't know when it happened, but I do. Clara's eyes burned. I love you too. Even though, especially because, Clara interrupted, you survived, Elias. You survived them, all of them. And you're still standing. That's not weakness. That's strength. Elias closed his eyes, his throat working. I don't feel strong. Then lean on me, Clara whispered, until you do. And standing there in the small cabin, wrapped in each other's arms, they both understood something fundamental had shifted. They weren't payment anymore, weren't a transaction. They were partners. And nothing, not her brother, not the town, not the whole damn territory, was going to change that. The days that followed Thomas's visit carried a strange, tense quiet. Not the comfortable silence Clara and Elias had built between them, but something heavier. Something that felt like waiting. Elias threw himself into the ranch work with renewed intensity, rising before dawn to mend fences, check the livestock, chop enough firewood to last through 2 winters. Clara watched him from the kitchen window, recognizing the pattern. He was preparing for something. Building walls the only way he knew how. Through labor, through usefulness, through making himself indispensable to the land. As if the land had ever been the thing that might reject him. You're going to work yourself into the ground, Clara said one evening as he came in for supper, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the autumn chill. Elias washed his hands at the basin, his movements precise. Ranch needs the work. The ranch is fine. You're not. He turned to look at her, water dripping from his fingers. His hearing had improved dramatically over the past weeks. He could follow conversations now, pick out individual sounds, even hear the mice skittering in the walls at night. But his voice still carried that careful quality, like he was translating every thought before speaking it aloud. I'm fine, he said. You're preparing for them to come back. Elias went still. Then he dried his hands, sat down at the table, and met her eyes. Aren't you? Clara set a bowl of stew in front of him, then sat across from him with her own. Thomas is a coward. He won't come back alone, but he's also lazy. It'll take him time to work up the courage. And when he does, then we deal with it. Clara broke a piece of bread, dipped it in the stew. Together. Elias studied her for a long moment. You're not afraid. I'm terrified, Clara admitted, but fear doesn't change what needs doing. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Where'd you learn that? From you. Clara reached across the table, touched his hand. You lived with pain for 25 years. You kept going. If that's not courage, I don't know what is. Elias turned his hand over, laced his fingers through hers. I had no choice. There's always a choice. You could have given up, let the pain win. But you didn't. Some days I wanted to. I know, but you're still here. They sat like that for a while, hands joined across the rough wooden table, the stew cooling in their bowls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying the smell of coming snow. I need to tell you something, Elias said finally. About the doctors. Clara waited. There were 7 of them, over the years. His voice had gone flat, emotionless, the tone of someone reciting facts to keep feeling at bay. The first one came when I was 8. My mother brought me in because I'd started banging my head against the wall. The pain was so bad I couldn't think, couldn't sleep. She was desperate. What did he say? That I was acting out, seeking attention because I couldn't hear. Elias's jaw tightened. He suggested my mother discipline me more strictly, said children with afflictions needed firmer boundaries. Clara's stomach turned. She didn't believe him. No, she took me to another doctor, and another. Each one had a different theory: weak constitution, nervous disorder, delusions brought on by isolation. He paused. One suggested trepanning, drilling a hole in my skull to relieve pressure. Dear heaven. My mother refused, but by the time I was 15, she'd spent every cent we had on doctors who couldn't help. When she died, I stopped going. Figured if they couldn't help, at least I'd save the money. Clara squeezed his hand harder. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm telling you because you need to understand something. Elias looked at her directly, his dark eyes intense. When you pulled that thing out of my ear, you didn't just end the pain. You proved I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't been imagining it all those years. That's worth more than the hearing, more than the voice. You gave me back my sanity. Clara's throat tightened. Elias, let me finish. His voice roughened. I know why you married me. I know it wasn't choice, but you chose to stay. You chose to look when everyone else turned away, and I need you to know, whatever happens with your brother, with the town, with any of it, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. Clara stood, rounded the table, and pulled him into her arms. Elias held her tight, his face pressed against her shoulder, his breath warmed through her dress. I don't regret it, she whispered. Not for a second. They stood there until the stew went cold and the fire burned low, holding each other in the gathering darkness. 2 weeks passed without incident. Then 3. Clara began to hope that maybe Thomas had slunk back to whatever hole he'd crawled from, that maybe they'd seen the last of him. She should have known better. The fire started just after midnight. Clara woke to Elias shaking her shoulder, his face stark in the darkness. Smoke, he said urgently. The barn. She smelled it then. Thick, acrid, wrong. They scrambled from bed, pulling on clothes with shaking hands, and ran outside. The barn was engulfed. Flames licked up the sides, consuming the dry wood with terrifying speed. Inside, the horses screamed. The animals! Clara gasped. Elias was already running. He hit the barn door at full speed, kicked it open, disappeared into the smoke and fire. Clara's heart stopped. She grabbed the water bucket from the porch, knew even as she ran toward the well that it was useless, that the barn was lost. But she had to try, had to do something. Elias emerged from the smoke leading both horses, their eyes rolling white with terror. He got them clear of the barn, slapped them toward the far pasture, then turned back. The chickens! He shouted over the roar of flames. The milk cow! Elias, no! Clara grabbed his arm. It's not safe. He looked at her, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. The livestock represented their livelihood. Without them, they'd have nothing. I have to try, he said. Then he plunged back into the inferno. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Seconds stretched into hours. The flames grew higher, hotter, consuming the structure from the inside out. She was about to run in after him when Elias stumbled out again, the milk cow bellowing beside him, his face black with soot. He got the cow clear, bent double coughing, then straightened. Chickens are gone, he rasped. Roof's about to collapse. As if summoned by his words, the barn's ridgepole gave way with a sound like thunder. The entire structure folded inward, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Clara and Elias backed away from the heat, watching their barn burn to ash and ember. How did this start? Clara asked, though she already knew. Elias pointed to the ground near the barn's foundation. Even in the firelight, Clara could see the trail of kerosene leading away from the structure, could see the footprints, multiple sets trampled into the mud. Her brother. Had to be. They're trying to drive us out, she said quietly. They're trying to break us. Elias wiped soot from his face, his expression hard. There's a difference. What do? We rebuild. He looked at her, firelight dancing in his eyes. And we make damn sure they know it didn't work. They spent the rest of the night making sure the fire didn't spread, hauling water from the creek, beating out embers that drifted toward the cabin. By dawn, they were exhausted, filthy, and facing a smoking ruin where their barn had stood. But they were alive. The animals were safe. And Clara felt a fierce burning anger in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm going into town," she said. Elias looked up sharply. "Clara, I'm going to the sheriff. This is arson, attempted murder maybe. They can't just—" "The sheriff won't help." Elias's voice was flat. "He's been in Sweetwater longer than I have. Knows your brother, knows me. Who do you think he'll believe? But we have evidence. We have kerosene and footprints. They'll say it was an accident, or that I started it myself for insurance money, or that you did it to frame your brother because you're unhappy." He shook his head. "Trust me. I've lived here long enough to know how this works." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "So we do nothing?" "We do exactly what I said. We rebuild. We show them they can't burn us out." Elias stepped closer, his voice softening. "And we watch our backs." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to storm into town and force someone, anyone, to listen. But she saw the weariness in Elias's eyes, the resignation that came from years of being dismissed, and she understood. Fighting the system wouldn't help. Not here. Not now. So she nodded. "All right. We rebuild." Elias touched her face, left a smudge of soot on her cheek. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You didn't start this fire. They did. I brought you into this. Into my life, into this mess." "No." Clara caught his hand, held it against her cheek. "I walked into this. And I'm staying, fire or no fire." Something in Elias's expression cracked. He pulled her against him, held her so tight she could barely breathe. And Clara held him back, the smell of smoke and sweat and fear surrounding them both. "We'll make it through this," she whispered. "We have to." "I know," but his voice shook. The rebuilding started the next day. Elias worked with methodical intensity, clearing the debris, salvaging what he could, planning the new structure. Clara helped where she was able, hauling charred boards, organizing salvaged nails, keeping track of measurements. But her mind was elsewhere. 3 days after the fire, while Elias was in the far pasture checking fence lines, Clara saddled one of the horses and rode into town. She didn't tell him where she was going, didn't ask permission, she just went. Sweetwater looked the same as always, dusty Main Street, false front buildings, people going about their business. Clara tied the horse outside the general store and walked directly to the building marked Sheriff. The man behind the desk was in his 50s, heavy-set, with a face that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He looked up when Clara entered, his expression shifting from boredom to wariness. "Mrs. Boone," he said slowly, "wasn't expecting you." "I'm here to report a crime, Sheriff Donnelly." Clara kept her voice level. "Our barn was burned down 4 nights ago, deliberately. We found evidence of arson." Donnelly leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "That's so?" "Yes, kerosene trail, multiple sets of footprints. This wasn't an accident." "You see who did it?" "No, but my brother visited us the week before, made threats." Donnelly's expression didn't change. "Thomas Whitmore? Your own brother?" "Yes. And you think he burned down your barn?" "I think he was involved, yes." Donnelly sighed, pulled out a piece of paper, made a show of writing something down. "I'll look into it, Mrs. Boone. But I gotta tell you, accusations like this, against family, they tend to cause more problems than they solve." Clara's jaw tightened. "More problems than arson?" "I'm just saying, married life can be stressful, especially out there, isolated like you are. Sometimes folks imagine things, get paranoid. I'm not imagining the pile of ash where our barn used to be." "No, ma'am, but fires happen. Dry wood, sparks from the stove, animal knocking over a lantern." "We found kerosene," Claire repeated, her voice hard. "And footprints." "I'll look into it," Donnelly said again, in a tone that suggested he'd do nothing of the sort. "Anything else?" Clara stared at him, understanding finally sinking in. Elias had been right. The sheriff wasn't going to help, wasn't going to investigate, wasn't going to do a damn thing except file her complaint in whatever dusty drawer he kept for inconvenient truths. "No," she said quietly. "Nothing else." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Sheriff, when this escalates, and it will, remember that I came to you first. Remember that I tried to do this the right way. Donnelly shifted uncomfortably. That some kind of threat, Mrs. Boone? No, just a fact. Clara opened the door. Have a good day. She walked out into the sunlight, climbed back on her horse, and rode toward the edge of town. But instead of heading home, she turned down a side street toward a small white house with a neat garden. Dr. Harrison's practice. The doctor was an older man, thin and precise, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up when Clara knocked on his open door, surprise crossing his face. Mrs. Boone, are you injured? No, doctor. I need information. Harrison gestured to a chair. About? Clara sat, arranging her skirts, choosing her words carefully. My husband was deaf from childhood until recently. His hearing has partially returned. I want to understand how that's medically possible. Harrison frowned. Deafness is rarely reversible, Mrs. Boone, especially if it's congenital or caused by early trauma. What if it wasn't congenital? What if there was a foreign object, something that caused both the deafness and chronic pain? The doctor's frown deepened. What kind of object? Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. Inside, preserved in alcohol, was the centipede. She'd kept it, knowing instinctively that she might need proof someday. She set it on the doctor's desk. Harrison picked up the vial, held it to the light, and went very still. Where did this come from? My husband's ear. I removed it myself 4 weeks ago. You... Harrison looked at her sharply. That's not possible. It's preserved in alcohol on your desk, doctor. I'd say it's very possible. Harrison examined the vial more closely, turning it in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. If this is genuine, and I'm not saying I believe it is, but if it is, then your husband is extraordinarily lucky to be alive. An organism living in the ear canal for any length of time would cause severe infection, possible brain involvement, certainly permanent damage. He had chronic headaches for 25 years, saw 7 different doctors, none of them found it. Harrison set the vial down slowly. 7 doctors. Yes, and none of them thought to examine the ear thoroughly? To use an otoscope? They told him the pain was in his head, that he was imagining it, that his deafness was causing psychological issues. Claire's voice hardened. They dismissed him because he couldn't hear their questions, because it was easier to call him crazy than to actually look. Harrison removed his spectacles, cleaned them with a handkerchief, replaced them. Mrs. Boone, I don't know what you expect me to say. I expect you to acknowledge that my husband was failed, repeatedly, by people who were supposed to help him. I can't speak to the competence of other physicians. Then speak to your own. Clara leaned forward. If I brought my husband to you today with his symptoms, would you actually examine him, or would you see a deaf rancher and decide he wasn't worth your time? Harrison's face flushed. That's an unfair accusation. Is it? Because so far every person in authority I've spoken to has suggested I'm either lying or imagining things. The sheriff thinks I'm paranoid. What will you think, doctor? That I'm hysterical? That I planted this creature in a vial to make a point? I think, Harrison said carefully, that you're a woman under considerable stress who may be looking for someone to blame for your husband's condition. Clara stood. Thank you for your time, doctor. Mrs. Boone, keep the vial, study it if you like, or throw it away and forget this conversation ever happened. I don't imagine it matters much either way. She walked to the door, paused. But when you're lying in bed tonight, ask yourself what you would do if that creature had been eating your brain for 25 years. Ask yourself if you'd be grateful to the person who finally looked. She left before he could respond, before the anger shaking through her could spill over into something she'd regret. The ride back to the ranch was long and cold. By the time Clara arrived, Elias had already started work on the barn's foundation, laying new stones with careful precision. He looked up when she dismounted, taking in her expression, and his own face went carefully neutral. Where were you? Town, the sheriff's office. Elias set down the stone he'd been holding. Clara, you were right. He won't help, suggested I was imagining things. She tied the horse to the fence post, her movement sharp with residual anger. Then I went to Dr. Harrison. Why? Because I wanted him to see what 7 other doctors missed. I wanted someone to acknowledge what happened to you. She looked at Elias directly. He didn't believe me either, suggested I was under stress, looking for someone to blame. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to her, pulled her into his arms. I told you they wouldn't listen. I know, Clara's voice broke. I wanted someone to care, someone besides us. I care. You care. That's enough. Is it? Clara pulled back to look at him. They burned our barn, Elias. They're going to keep coming, keep pushing, and no one's going to stop them. I know. So what do we do? Elias touched her face, his rough palm warm against her cheek. We survive. Same as always. We survive, and we refuse to break. What if surviving isn't enough? Then we make it enough. His voice was firm. We rebuild this barn. We plant crops in the spring. We live our lives. And we don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us run. Clara searched his face, seeing the determination there, the stubborn refusal to yield. And she understood something fundamental about the man she'd married. He'd spent 25 years in pain, 25 years being dismissed, ignored, called crazy. And he'd survived it all through sheer bloody-minded endurance. If anyone knew how to outlast cruelty, it was Elias Boone. All right, she said quietly. We survive. Elias kissed her forehead, then her mouth, slow and deliberate. When he pulled back, his eyes were fierce. They bet $50 I wouldn't marry you. I'm about to make them regret that wager for the rest of their lives. Clara felt something fierce and bright kindle in her chest. How? By proving that we're stronger than they ever imagined, that we're not going anywhere, that they can burn our barn, spread their rumors, try to break us, and we'll still be here, still standing, still together. That's a long game. I'm patient. Elias smiled, hard and cold. And I've got nothing but time. Clara smiled back, feeling the anger in her chest transform into something cleaner, sharper, purpose. Then let's get back to work, she said. They returned to the barn foundation, working side by side as the sun climbed higher, and with every stone they laid, with every nail they drove, they built something more than a barn. They built a statement, they built defiance, and they built a future neither of them was willing to surrender. The barn rose from the ashes over the next month, board by board, nail by nail. Elias worked with relentless focus, his hands calloused and bleeding by evening, his shoulders carved with new muscle. Clara worked alongside him, learning to measure timber, to swing a hammer without smashing her thumb, to read the sky for coming weather. They spoke less during those weeks, not from anger or distance, but from a shared understanding that didn't require words. Every beam they raised was an act of defiance. Every shingle they laid was a declaration that they would not be moved. The townspeople noticed, of course. Travelers passing through would slow their wagons to stare at the deaf rancher and his wife, rebuilding what should have broken them. Some offered help, a few boards here, a bucket of nails there, but most just watched with the kind of cautious curiosity reserved for people who refuse to follow the expected script. Clara caught the whispers when she went to the general store for supplies, heard the words stubborn and unnatural, and once whispered behind a hand, cursed. She paid for her flour and sugar and coffee with coins Elias had earned selling 2 horses to a passing cavalry unit, kept her head high, and ignored the stares. But ignoring didn't mean forgetting. 6 weeks after the fire, on a bitter November morning, Clara woke to find frost covering the inside of the windows, and Elias already gone from their bed. She dressed quickly, wrapped herself in a shawl, and found him outside the nearly finished barn, staring at something on the ground. "What is it?" she called. Elias didn't turn, just pointed. Clara crossed the frozen yard and looked down at what had stopped him. A dead chicken. Throat cut. Placed deliberately on the barn's threshold, its blood dark against the new wood. Not an accident. Not a predator. A message. "When?" Clara's voice came out flat. "Sometime in the night. Blood still tacky." Elias crouched down, examined the carcass without touching it. Professional, clean cut. Someone who knows what they're doing. Thomas doesn't have the skill for this. No, but he has friends who do. Elias stood, his jaw tight. They're escalating. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold seep through the shawl. What do they want? For us to leave. To give up. To prove they were right about me. He looked at her, his dark eyes hard. Or maybe they just want to hurt us because they can. We can't keep living like this, waiting for the next attack. I know. So what do we do? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the dead chicken to the barn to the mountains rising in the distance. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, careful. We make a choice. We either leave, start over somewhere they can't find us, or we stay and fight. Fight how? The sheriff won't help. The town won't listen. Then we fight the way people like us have always fought. Elias met her eyes. We outlast them. We make ourselves too stubborn to break, too difficult to ignore. We build this ranch into something so solid, so successful, that they can't pretend we don't matter. Clara studied his face, seeing the determination there, the anger transmuted into cold purpose. That could take years. I have years. They might kill us first. They might. Elias stepped closer, took her hands in his. But I'd rather die fighting for something that's mine than run from people who think I'm worth nothing. And this ranch, this life, his voice roughened, you're worth fighting for. Clara felt something shift in her chest, sharp and sweet and terrifying. You really mean that? Every word. She looked at the dead chicken, at the blood staining the new wood, at the life they'd built from ash and stubbornness. She thought about the Clara who'd stood in her mother's yellowed wedding dress, numb with humiliation, believing she was worth exactly $50. The Clara would have run. But this Clara, the one who'd reached into her husband's skull and pulled out a nightmare, who'd stood up to her brother, who'd rebuilt a barn with her own bleeding hands, this Clara was done running. Then we stay, she said. And we fight. Elias's expression cracked into something that might have been relief or pride or both. He pulled her against him, held her tight enough that she could feel his heartbeat through his shirt. We'll need help, he murmured into her hair. Can't do this alone. Where do we get help? No one in town. Not in town, but there are other ranchers out here. People who know what it's like to be on the margins. Some of them might listen. Clara pulled back to look at him. You know people? A few, kept to myself mostly, but there were some who didn't turn away when I came to town, who treated me like a person instead of a ghost. He touched her face. Worth trying, at least. All right, we try. They buried the chicken and finished the barn by early December. It wasn't as large as the original. They didn't have the money or materials for that, but it was solid, well-built, and wholly theirs. The day they hung the doors, Elias stood back and looked at the structure with something close to satisfaction. It'll do, he said. Clara slipped her hand into his. It's perfect. That night, they celebrated with a quiet supper and the last of the whiskey Elias kept for medicinal purposes. Sitting by the fire, warm and fed, and together, Clara felt a fragile contentment settle over her. Tell me something, she said. Something about you I don't know. Elias considered, swirling the whiskey in his glass. I wanted to be a teacher when I was young, before the pain got bad. Thought maybe I could help other kids like me, ones who didn't fit. Clara's throat tightened. Why didn't you? No school would hire a deaf man. Didn't matter that I could read and write better than most. Couldn't hear the students, couldn't speak clearly, couldn't be trusted. He smiled without humor. So I came out here. Figured if I couldn't teach, I could at least build something. You did build something, this ranch, this life. Our life, Elias corrected. He set down his glass, took her hand. Your turn. Tell me something I don't know. Clara thought about all the things she could say, about her childhood, her mother, her dreams of a different life, but what came out was simpler, rawer. I used to think I was worthless. That being sold for $50 proved I didn't matter to anyone. And now? Now I know I was wrong. I matter to you, and that's enough. Elias pulled her into his lap, buried his face in her neck. You matter more than you know. They made love that night with the kind of desperate tenderness that comes from knowing how close they'd come to losing everything. And afterward, lying tangled together in their narrow bed, Clara thought that maybe being sold for $50 was the best thing that had ever happened to her, because it had brought her here, to this man, to this moment, to the first real home she'd ever known. 2 days later, a stranger arrived at the ranch. Clara saw him first, a man on horseback, picking his way carefully through the snow, leading a pack mule behind him. She called for Elias, who emerged from the barn with a hammer in his hand, his expression wary. The stranger was older, maybe 60, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He raised his hand in greeting as he approached. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone?" "That's us," Elias said carefully. "Name's Benjamin Crawford. I run a ranch about 15 miles north of here. Heard you folks had some trouble." Clara and Elias exchanged glances. "What kind of trouble?" Clara asked. Crawford dismounted, moved slowly like a man who knew better than to spook skittish animals. "The kind that involves a burned barn and dead livestock left as warnings, the kind that makes good people nervous and bad people bold." "Who told you?" Elias's grip on the hammer tightened. "Word travels, and I've got eyes." Crawford nodded toward the new barn. "That's good work. Strong joints. You built it yourself?" "We did. Figured as much. Heard you were the stubborn type." Crawford smiled slightly. "Meant as a compliment before you take offense." Clara stepped forward. "What do you want, Mr. Crawford?" "To help, if you'll have it. See, I know what it's like to be pushed around by folks who think they own the territory. Had my own troubles over the years, and I've learned that the only way to survive out here is to stand together." Elias studied the older man, suspicion and hope warring in his expression. "You're offering help to a deaf rancher you've never met? Why?" "Because you're not deaf anymore, from what I hear, and because you married a woman brave enough to pull a bug out of your head with nothing but tweezers and grit." Crawford's smile widened. "That's the kind of people I want as neighbors." Clara's eyes widened. "How do you Dr. Harrison, he's my cousin, came by last month, showed me the vial you left him. Couldn't stop talking about it, said it was medically impossible, but there it was, preserved in alcohol." Crawford shook his head. "He's been examining it ever since, writing to colleagues back east, making himself half crazy trying to understand how you survived." Elias went very still. "He believes us?" "He believes the evidence, and he believes his cousin wouldn't marry a woman foolish enough to fake something like that." Crawford pulled a folded paper from his coat. "He asked me to give you this." Clara took the paper, unfolded it with shaking hands. "Doctor, Harrison's precise handwriting covered the page. Mrs. Boone, I owe you an apology. I dismissed you when I should have listened, and for that I am deeply ashamed. I have spent the last month examining the specimen you provided and corresponding with colleagues across the country. The consensus is clear. Your husband survived something that should have killed him, and you removed it with remarkable skill. I have documented the case and would like to examine Mr. Boone properly, with your permission, to assess any remaining damage and ensure proper healing. I understand if you refuse. I gave you no reason to trust me, but I hope you will allow me the chance to do what I should have done from the start. Help. With sincere respect, Dr. Malcolm Harrison." Clara read the letter twice, then handed it to Elias. He scanned it quickly, his expression unreadable. "He wants to help now," he said flatly, after Clara did all the work. "Better late than never," Crawford said. "And you'll need medical documentation if you want to prove what happened. Make a case that you're not crazy, that the other doctors were wrong." "Why would we need to prove that?" Crawford's expression grew serious. "Because your brother's been talking, spreading stories that you're both unstable, that the fire was your own doing, that Clara's holding you against your will, taking advantage of a simple man." He paused. "It's ugly talk, and it's starting to stick." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "That's not true. None of it." "I know, but truth doesn't matter if enough people believe the lie." Crawford gestured to the letter. "Harrison's documentation could help. Medical proof that you were suffering from a real condition, that Clara saved your life. Hard to call someone unstable when a respected doctor says otherwise." Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter. Then he looked at Clara. "What do you think?" "I think we need allies more than we need pride," she said quietly. "And if Dr. Harrison is willing to help now, We should let him. Elias nodded slowly. All right, we'll see him. Crawford's shoulders relaxed. Good, I'll arrange it. Bring him out here so you don't have to go into town. Less chance of trouble that way. Why are you doing this? Clara asked. Really? Crawford looked at her for a long moment, something sad and understanding in his eyes. Because 30 years ago, I married a woman the town didn't approve of. Chinese immigrant, came here after the railroad. Folks said she was cursed, that our marriage was against nature, that we'd bring shame to the territory. He paused. They burned our first house, killed our livestock, did everything they could to drive us out. What happened? Elias asked quietly. We stayed, built a bigger house, bought more land, raised 3 children who are smarter and stronger than anyone who tried to hurt us. Crawford's voice hardened. And one by one, the people who tormented us either left or died or learned to live with the fact that we weren't going anywhere. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Your wife, is she... She passed 5 years ago. Cancer. Crawford's expression softened. But she lived long enough to see our grandchildren born. Long enough to know we won. I'm sorry, Clara said. Don't be. She had a good life, a full life, and she taught me that the best revenge against people who want you to fail is to succeed so thoroughly they choke on it. He smiled. Thought you two might appreciate the lesson. Elias extended his hand. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Crawford shook it firmly. Call me Ben, and you're welcome. Now, let me show you what I brought. He led them to the pack mule and began unpacking supplies, seed for spring planting, feed for the animals, tools to replace what had been lost in the fire. Clara and Elias watched in stunned silence as the pile grew. We can't pay for this, Elias said finally. Didn't ask you to. Consider it a loan. You pay me back when you can, or you help someone else when they need it. Either way works. Clara's throat tightened. Ben, don't cry, Mrs. Boone. Save your tears for when you really need them. You've got a long fight ahead. He finished unpacking, then swung back into his saddle. I'll be back in a week with Dr. Harrison. Meanwhile, keep your eyes open. Your brother's not done yet. We know, Elias said. Ben nodded, then looked between them, his expression grave. One more thing. If it comes to real trouble, the kind where the law won't help and talking won't work, you come find me. I've got friends. Good men who know how to handle themselves. We won't let them hurt you. You'd do that? Clara asked. For strangers? You're not strangers anymore. You're neighbors. And out here, that means something. Ben tipped his hat. Be safe, you two. He rode away, the mule plodding behind him, leaving Clara and Elias standing in the snow, surrounded by unexpected gifts. Elias turned to Clara, something like wonder in his expression. Did that just happen? I think so. Clara looked at the supplies, at the path Ben had taken, at her husband. I think we just made a friend. Maybe more than one. Elias pulled her close. Maybe we're not as alone as we thought. Clara leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. Maybe not. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, burning away the frost, bringing a fragile warmth to the winter day. And for the first time since the fire, Clara felt something that might have been hope. Dr. Harrison arrived the following week, just as Ben had promised. He came in a small buggy, his medical bag on the seat beside him, his expression carefully neutral. Clara met him at the door, Elias standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Boone, Mr. Boone. Harrison removed his hat. Thank you for seeing me. Come in, Clara said, stepping aside. Harrison entered slowly, taking in the simple cabin, the neat kitchen, the handmade furniture. His gaze lingered on Elias, and Clara saw the exact moment the doctor truly looked, not at a case study or a curiosity, but at a man. Mr. Boone, Harrison said carefully, I owe you an apology. Several, in fact. I dismissed your wife when she came to me, and in doing so, I dismissed you. That was inexcusable. Elias's expression didn't change. Why the change of heart? Because I examined the specimen your wife provided. Because I consulted with colleagues far more experienced than I am. And because I spent 20 years treating patients in San Francisco before coming here, and in all that time, I never saw anything like what Mrs. Boone described. Harrison set down his bag. I was wrong, and I'd like the chance to examine you properly, if you'll allow it. Elias glanced at Clara. She nodded slightly. All right, Elias said, but Clara stays. Of course. The examination took nearly an hour. Harrison checked Elias's ear with instruments Clara had never seen, tested his hearing with a series of tones, asked detailed questions about the pain, the headaches, the years of suffering. He took notes in a leather journal, his handwriting quick and precise. Finally, he sat back, removed his spectacles, and cleaned them thoughtfully. The damage is extensive, he said quietly. The ear canal is scarred, the eardrum partially compromised. It's remarkable you can hear it all. But I can, Elias said. Yes, which suggests the centipede was causing mechanical blockage rather than structural damage to the inner ear. Once removed, the pathway cleared. Harrison replaced his spectacles. It's extraordinary, Mr. Boone. Medically improbable, but undeniable. The other doctors were lazy or incompetent or both. Harrison's voice hardened. There's no excuse for what they did to you. A simple examination with an otoscope would have revealed the problem. Instead, they dismissed you because treating you would have been difficult. Inconvenient. Elias's jaw tightened. Can you prove that? I can document what I've found. I can write to my colleagues, provide medical testimony if needed. But proving negligence is difficult, Mr. Boone, especially against established physicians. I don't care about negligence. Elias leaned forward. I care about my wife's reputation, about people in town saying she's unstable, that she made this up. Can you prove she saved my life? Harrison looked at Clara, then back at Elias. Yes, I can prove that, unequivocally. Something in Elias's shoulders relaxed. Then that's what I need. Harrison pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, began writing. I'll prepare a formal medical report detailing my findings, the condition I observed, and the treatment Mrs. Boone provided. I'll submit it to the Territorial Medical Board and provide you with copies for your records. Will it help? Clara asked quietly. Against gossip? Probably not. People believe what they want to believe. Harrison paused. But it will establish a medical record, proof that you're not delusional or unstable. And if this escalates legally, if your brother tries to claim you're unfit or dangerous, you'll have documentation from a licensed physician stating otherwise. Clara felt a weight lift from her chest. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I haven't earned it. Harrison finished writing, signed the bottom with a flourish. But I intend to, starting now. He spent another hour teaching Clara proper wound care, explaining signs of infection to watch for, demonstrating techniques for managing Elias's residual pain. He left them with supplies, clean bandages, antiseptic, laudanum for severe episodes, and a promise to return monthly to check Elias's progress. One more thing, Harrison said as he prepared to leave. Ben Crawford mentioned your brother's been spreading rumors. Be careful, Mrs. Boone. Men like that, when they can't break you physically, they'll try to break you socially, isolate you, make you desperate. We're not alone, Clara said. Not anymore. Harrison smiled slightly. No, you're not. Ben's a good man, loyal, and he's not the only one out here who's tired of bullies. He climbed into his buggy, gathered the reins. Take care of each other, and don't hesitate to send for me if you need help. He drove away, leaving Clara and Elias standing in the doorway. Medical documentation, Elias said wonderingly. Never thought I'd have that. You deserve it. You always did. Elias pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. We're building something, Clara. Something they can't burn down or talk away. What's that? Proof that we matter, that we're real, that they can't make us disappear just by pretending we don't exist. Clara wrapped her arms around him, pressed her face against his chest. I love you. I love you too. His voice roughened. And I'm not letting anyone take you from me. They stood there in the winter sunlight, holding each other against the cold and the cruelty and the long fight ahead. And Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together, because they were no longer payment or transaction or bet. They were partners. And nothing, not fire, not rumors, not the whole damn territory, was going to break them. Winter deepened over the Montana Territory, bringing snow that buried the fences and winds that rattled the windows like skeletal fingers. But inside the cabin, Clara and Elias built a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth and everything to do with the quiet certainty that they belonged to each other. The threats didn't stop, but they changed form. No more fires, no more dead animals. Instead, Clara found her credit cut off at the general store, the clerk suddenly unable to meet her eyes as he explained that her account had been closed. Elias discovered their fence lines cut, their livestock wandering onto neighboring property where they'd be impounded and fined. Small cruelties, calculated ones, the kind designed to drain resources and spirit without leaving evidence. But for every cut fence, Ben Crawford appeared with wire and help. For every closed account, another rancher's wife quietly sold Clara flour and coffee at cost, slipping the goods into her wagon when no one was looking. The community they were building, fragile, scattered, made of people who understood what it meant to be pushed to the margins, held. And Clara held on to something else, something she hadn't told Elias yet, because she wanted to be certain. She was pregnant, 2 months gone, maybe 3. Her monthly courses had stopped, her breasts were tender, and in the morning she woke with a queasiness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the life growing inside her. She should have been terrified, should have wondered how they'd manage a child with everything else pressing down on them. But every time she thought about telling Elias, she felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. This baby, their baby, was proof that they were building something permanent, something that couldn't be burned or stolen or talked away. She decided to tell him on Christmas Eve. Clara spent the day preparing, using the last of their sugar to make cookies from her mother's recipe, roasting the chicken Ben had brought them the week before. She hung pine branches over the doorway and lit candles in the windows, filling the cabin with warmth and light. Elias came in from the barn as the sun was setting, his face red with cold, snow dusting his shoulders. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the transformed cabin, and his expression softened into something that made Clara's heart ache. "What's all this?" His voice was stronger now, clearer. 3 months of use had strengthened his vocal cords, smoothed the rough edges. He still spoke carefully, deliberately, but he spoke. "Christmas," Clara said. "I know it's not much, but it's perfect." Elias crossed to her, pulled her into his arms. "You're perfect." They ate supper by candlelight, talking about small things, the mare that was due to foal in spring, the new chickens Ben had promised them, the seed they'd order for planting, ordinary things, beautiful things, the kind of conversation that built a life. When they finished, Clara stood and fetched a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I made you something." Elias took the package with careful hands, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a shirt Clara had sewn from fabric she'd traded eggs for, the stitches small and precise, the collar reinforced because she knew how hard he was on his clothes. He held it up, his throat working. "Clara, I wanted you to have something that was just yours, that no one could say came from charity or pity." She touched the fabric. "It's not fancy, but it's made with love," Elias finished. He set the shirt down carefully, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "I made you something too." Clara opened the box with shaking hands. Inside, nestled on a scrap of velvet, was a ring. Simple, carved from dark wood, polished until it gleamed. "It's pine," Elias said quietly, "from the tree where I proposed, where your father brought you to meet me. I know it's not gold or silver, but it's perfect." Clara slipped it onto her finger. "It fit exactly. How did you know my size?" "Measured your hand while you were sleeping." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Took me 3 tries to get it right." Clara threw her arms around him, buried her face in his neck. "I love it. I love you. I love you too." Elias held her tight, then pulled back to look at her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I'm just—" Clara took a breath, decided to trust the moment. "I'm pregnant." Elias went completely still. For a long, terrible second, Clara thought he was upset, that she'd miscalculated, that this was too much too soon. Then his face crumpled, and he started to cry. Not the quiet tears from the night she'd removed the centipede. These were great, shuddering sobs that shook his whole body. He sank into the chair, his hands covering his face, his shoulders heaving. Clara knelt beside him, alarmed. Elias, Elias, what's wrong? If you don't want. He lowered his hands and his face was wet and raw and filled with so much emotion Clara could barely look at it. Clara, I never let myself hope. His voice broke. A child. Our child. You're happy? Happy? He laughed, the sound wet and broken. I'm terrified. I'm overwhelmed. And I'm happier than I've ever been in my entire life. He pulled her into his lap, held her like she might disappear, pressed his face against her shoulder. When? Summer. July, maybe August. A summer baby. His hand moved to her stomach, rested there with reverent care. Can you feel? Not yet. Too early. But soon. Elias was quiet for a long time, his hand warm through her dress, his breathing gradually steadying. When he spoke again, his voice was rough but controlled. We need to be more careful. If your brother finds out, I know. Clara had already thought about this, about how pregnancy made her vulnerable, made them both targets. But we can't hide forever. Eventually, people will notice. Then we make sure we're ready, that we have help, that we're not alone when he comes for us. You think he will? I know he will. Elias's voice was grim. A child makes this real, makes us a family, and that's something he can't dismiss or mock or burn away. He'll see it as a threat. Then what do? We prepare. Elias lifted her hand, kissed the wooden ring, and we trust that the people who've helped us so far won't abandon us now. Clara nodded, leaning into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. And inside, in the warmth and light, they held each other and the fragile hope of the life they were building. The confrontation came in late January, on a day so cold the air hurt to breathe. Clara was hanging laundry, frozen within minutes, but she needed to do something with her hands. When she heard the horses, multiple riders, moving fast, she dropped the shirt she was holding and ran for the cabin. Elias! He emerged from his barn, saw her face, and immediately reached for the rifle he kept mounted just inside the door. How many? 4, maybe 5. Get inside, bar the door. I'm not leaving you. Clara. His voice was hard. Please. If something happens to me, you need to be safe. You and... He glanced at her stomach. Please. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him. But she thought of the baby, of the life they hadn't even begun yet, and she nodded. Be careful. She ran inside, slammed the door, dropped the heavy bar across it. Then she moved to the window, her heart hammering, and watched. The riders came into view, and Clara's stomach dropped. Thomas led them, drunk and swaying in his saddle. Behind him were 3 men Clara recognized from the saloon, rough types, the kind who hired out for work that required more muscle than morals. And bringing up the rear, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Sheriff Donnelly. Elias stood in front of the barn, the rifle held loosely but ready, his expression calm. That's far enough. Thomas reined in his horse 20 feet away, a mean grin splitting his face. Well, well, the deaf man speaks. Miracles really do happen. State your business, Thomas, then leave. My business? Thomas laughed, the sound ugly. My business is my sister. Heard she's carrying your bastard. That true? Elias's expression didn't change. My wife is pregnant, yes, and any child of ours is legitimate. Wife, Thomas spat the word. She's not your wife. She's property I sold to settle a debt, and I'm here to collect her. She's my wife by law, by choice, and she's not going anywhere. One of the men behind Thomas shifted, his hand moving to his gun. Elias's rifle came up slightly, not quite aimed but ready. Sheriff Donnelly cleared his throat. Now, Mr. Boone, let's not do anything rash. I'm not the one who rode onto another man's property with armed men, Sheriff. Elias's voice was cold. That would be Thomas and his friends. We're here to check on Mrs. Boone's welfare, Donnelly said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe his own words. There have been concerns, reports that she's being held against her will. From who? Multiple sources. From Thomas. Who wants his sister back so he can sell her again? Elias took a step forward. Clara is fine. She's safe. And she chose to stay here. You want proof? Ask her yourself. Inside the cabin, Clara's hands were shaking. She knew what Elias was doing, forcing the confrontation, making them acknowledge her as a person with agency rather than property to be transferred. Clara, Thomas shouted. You in there? Come out where we can see you. Clara took a breath, lifted the bar, and opened the door. She stepped out onto the porch, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach, and looked at her brother with all the contempt she could muster. I'm here, Thomas, and I'm not coming with you. The hell you're not. You're my sister. I was your sister, until you sold me for $50 to pay your debt. Clara's voice rang clear and hard across the frozen yard. Now I'm Elias Boone's wife, and I'm staying with my husband. He's got you brainwashed. He's got me safe, fed, respected. Clara descended the porch steps, moving to stand beside Elias, which is more than I ever got from you. Thomas's face flushed dark red. You ungrateful... Careful, Elias said quietly, the rifle still ready. That's my wife you're talking to. One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. This is a waste of time, Whitmore. She's clearly choosing to stay. Shut up. Thomas swung down from his horse, swaying slightly. I'm not leaving without her. She's carrying our family's blood. She's carrying my child, Elias interrupted. Our child, and you have no claim to either of them. Thomas took a stumbling step forward. I have every claim. She's my sister, my family. And I'm not letting some freak who can barely talk keep her... Elias moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move. He closed the distance between them, grabbed Thomas by the collar, and lifted him onto his toes. I can talk just fine, Elias said, his voice low and deadly calm. And I can hear every word you're saying. Want to know what I hear? A drunk, a coward, a man who sold his own sister and is now pretending it was for her own good. He shoved Thomas backward. You want to know what else I hear? Nothing, because after today you're not welcome on my property. Not now. Not ever. Thomas caught himself, his hand moving to his belt where Clara knew he kept a knife. You threatening me, Boone? I'm telling you how it is. You come here again, you threaten my wife again, and I'll do more than throw you off my land. That's assault, Donnelly said weakly. I could arrest you. For defending my property, my family. Elias didn't take his eyes off Thomas. Go ahead, Sheriff. Arrest me. But you'll have to explain to Judge Morrison why you're arresting a man for protecting his pregnant wife from armed intruders. Donnelly shifted uncomfortably. Now, Mr. Boone. Judge Morrison's a friend of mine, a new voice called out. Everyone turned. Ben Crawford rode into the yard, flanked by 4 other ranchers Clara recognized from the scattered homesteads. All armed, all grim-faced. Ben, Elias said quietly, didn't expect you. Figured you might need the backup. Heard Whitmore here was planning something stupid. Ben stopped his horse, looked at Thomas with cold contempt. Looks like I heard right. Thomas looked between Ben's group and the sheriff, his bravado visibly draining. This doesn't concern you, Crawford. It concerns me when good people are being harassed by trash. Ben dismounted slowly. See, Sheriff, I've been keeping track. The barn fire? I've got witnesses who saw Whitmore and his friends near the Boone property that night. The dead livestock. More witnesses. The cut fences? Same thing. He pulled a folded document from his coat. All documented, all signed, all ready to be presented to Judge Morrison if needed. Donnelly's face went pale. Ben, you can't... Can't what? Can't protect my neighbors? Can't document crimes when the law won't? Ben's voice hardened. Or can't embarrass you by showing how you've been ignoring harassment for months because the victims weren't important enough. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Finally, one of the hired men cleared his throat. This ain't worth it, Whitmore. Let's go. I'm not... Yes, you are. The man turned his horse. I signed on for intimidation, not for going up against Crawford and his friends. You want to commit suicide, do it without me. The other 2 hired men followed, leaving Thomas alone with the sheriff. Thomas looked at Clara, and for a moment she saw something that might have been hurt in his eyes. You really choosing him over your own blood? Clara thought about all the ways she could answer, about forgiveness and family and the ties that bind. But what came out was simpler, truer. You stopped being my blood when you made me a bet, Thomas. Elias became my family when he treated me like I mattered. Thomas flinched. For a second, Clara thought he might say something, might apologize or argue, or finally acknowledge what he'd done. But he just turned, climbed onto his horse, and rode away without looking back. Sheriff Donnelly lingered, his expression miserable. For what it's worth, Mrs. Boone, I'm sorry. I should have helped when you came to me. Yes, Clara said flatly. You should have. Donnelly nodded, tipped his hat, and followed Thomas. The moment they disappeared down the road, Clara's legs gave out. Elias caught her, held her up, his arms strong and steady. It's over, he murmured. It's done. You don't know that. He could come back. He won't. Ben dismounted, approached them with careful respect. Men like Thomas only fight when they think they can win. He knows now he can't. Not against you. Not against us. Clara looked at the ranchers who'd come to help, men she barely knew, who'd risked themselves for strangers. Why did you help us? One of them, a weathered man named Davies, spoke up. Because Crawford asked, and because you stood up when most would have run. That means something out here. Means you're one of us, another added. Like it or not. Clara felt tears burn her eyes. Thank you. All of you. Don't thank us yet, Ben said. We've still got a barn raising to finish in the spring, and I expect you two to help when the Hendersons need their roof patched. He smiled slightly. Community works both ways. We'll be there, Elias said. The ranchers left as quietly as they'd come, leaving Clara and Elias standing in the yard holding each other against the cold. Is it really over? Clara whispered. Clara said, The fighting? Maybe. The judgment? Probably not. Elias turned her to face him, his hands framing her face. But we have something now we didn't have before. Witnesses. Documentation. Friends. And each other. And a baby coming. And a baby coming. His smile was like sunrise. We're going to be fine, Clara. Better than fine. She believed him. The months that followed were marked by quiet growth rather than conflict. Clara's pregnancy progressed, her body changing in ways that both terrified and amazed her. Elias treated her like she was made of spun glass, which irritated her until she realized it came from wonder rather than condescension. Dr. Harrison visited monthly, monitoring both Clara's pregnancy and Elias's continued recovery. His reports, meticulously documented and signed, became part of their permanent record, proof that they were not the unstable couple Thomas had painted them to be, but ordinary people building an ordinary life. Ben Crawford and his network of ranchers became regular visitors, bringing supplies, sharing labor, creating the kind of community that made survival possible in the harsh territory. Clara learned their stories, immigrants and outcasts and people who'd come west because they didn't fit back east, people like her and Elias. Spring came with mud and rain and the backbreaking work of planting. Clara helped where she could, though Elias grew increasingly protective as her belly swelled. By June, she was enormous, uncomfortable, and ready for the pregnancy to be over. I'm the size of a barn, she complained one evening, trying to find a comfortable position in their bed. You're beautiful, Elias said, his hand resting on her stomach. You're obligated to say that. I'm saying it because it's true. He leaned down, pressed a kiss to her belly. You're carrying our child. You've never been more beautiful. The baby kicked, and Elias's eyes widened. Did you feel that? I've been feeling it for weeks. You're just now paying attention. I'm always paying attention. He kissed her stomach again, then her mouth, slow and sweet. I love you. I love you too, even though I'm enormous, especially because you're enormous. He pulled her against him, careful of her belly. Our son or daughter is in there, growing, getting ready to meet us. What if I'm a terrible mother? You won't be. How do you know? Because you loved me when no one else did. Because you fought for me when it would have been easier to walk away. Because you see people, Clara, really see them. He kissed her forehead. Our child is lucky to have you. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. Pregnancy had made her emotional, prone to crying at the smallest things. What if something goes wrong? Then we'll handle it. Together. His voice was firm. "But nothing's going to go wrong. You're strong. Our baby's strong. And Dr. Harrison will be here." Clara nodded, trying to believe him, trying to push away the fear that whispered at the edges of her mind. 3 weeks later, on a sweltering July afternoon, her water broke. The labor was long and brutal. 20 hours of pain that made Clara understand why women screamed, why some didn't survive, why this was called the hardest work a body could do. Dr. Harrison stayed the entire time, monitoring her progress, offering encouragement. Ben's wife, Sarah, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and capable hands, helped Clara walk, breathe, endure. And Elias refused to leave. He sat beside her, held her hand, let her squeeze his fingers until they went white. When she screamed, he didn't flinch. When she begged for it to stop, he pressed kisses to her forehead and told her she was strong, she was brave, she could do this. "I can't," Clara sobbed during a particularly brutal contraction. "I can't, Elias." "You can. You are." His voice was steady, anchoring her. "Just a little longer, love. Just a little more." When the baby finally came, sliding into the world with an indignant wail that filled the cabin, Clara was too exhausted to cry. She just lay there, shaking, as Dr. Harrison cleaned the infant and Sarah pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. "It's a girl," Harrison said, his voice warm. "A beautiful, healthy girl." He placed the baby on Clara's chest, and she looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, the perfect miniature fingers, the dark eyes that blinked up at her with unfocused wonder. "Oh," Clara breathed. "Oh, Elias, look." But Elias was already looking and crying and laughing all at once. He reached out, touched their daughter's hand with one gentle finger, and the baby's tiny fist closed around it. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Clara asked. Elias was quiet for a moment, then said, "Hope, because that's what she is, what you both are." Clara looked at the baby, at Hope, and felt something fierce and protective and overwhelming flood through her. "Hope Boone, I like it." "Hope Boone," Elias repeated. He leaned down, kissed Clara's forehead, then his daughter's. "Welcome to the world, little one. We've been waiting for you." The weeks that followed were exhausting and beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Clara learned to feed the baby, to soothe her cries, to function on almost no sleep. Elias helped with everything, changing soiled cloths, walking the floor at night, taking Hope so Clara could rest. And slowly, impossibly, they found their rhythm as parents. Ben and Sarah visited often, bringing food and supplies and the kind of practical advice that only came from experience. Dr. Harrison checked on Hope weekly, declaring her healthy and thriving. Other ranchers stopped by with small gifts, a carved rattle, a quilt, a tiny dress sewn from scrap fabric. Clara had been alone for so long she'd forgotten what community felt like, what it meant to be surrounded by people who cared. One evening in late August, as the sun set over the mountains and Hope slept in her cradle, Elias found Clara on the porch, staring at the horizon. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. "Everything. Nothing." Clara leaned into him. "I was just remembering the day we got married, how numb I felt, how certain I was that my life was over. And now? Now I know it was just beginning." She turned to look at him, at the man who'd been sold a bride and gotten a partner instead. "I was so angry at my father, at Thomas, at everyone who treated me like I was worthless." "You were never worthless." "I know that now, but I didn't then." She touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "You taught me that, you and Hope. You showed me I was worth fighting for." Elias caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "You saved my life, Clara. Literally. Pulled a nightmare out of my skull when no one else would even look. I'm the one who should be grateful." "We saved each other," Clara said simply. "That's what marriage is supposed to be, isn't it? Two people choosing each other every day, even when it's hard." "Especially when it's hard." Elias pulled her closer. "I choose you, Clara Boone. Today and every day after." "I choose you too, Elias Boone. Today and always." They sat there as the stars came out, as Hope's soft breathing drifted through the open window, as the Montana night settled around them like a blessing. Clara thought about the $50 bet that had brought them together, about the crumpled note she'd burned in anger and shame, about how the worst thing that had ever happened to her had somehow become the best. She'd been sold like livestock, treated like property, dismissed and devalued and deemed worthless. But she'd found something in the wreckage of that humiliation, something Thomas and her father and everyone who'd underestimated her could never understand. She'd found herself, found her strength, found her voice, found her worth, and she'd found a man who saw all of it, the anger and the fear and the fierce determination, and loved her not despite those things, but because of them. A year later, on a crisp autumn morning, Clara and Elias stood in the churchyard in Sweetwater, not for a wedding or a funeral, but for something else entirely. Dr. Harrison had petitioned the Territorial Medical Board to investigate the doctors who'd dismissed Elias's condition. The investigation had been long, thorough, and ultimately damning. 3 physicians had been censured for negligence. 1 had lost his license entirely. But more importantly, Harrison had presented a paper at a medical conference in Denver, documenting Elias's case, Clara's intervention, and the extraordinary circumstances of his recovery. The paper had been published in a medical journal. Copies were being distributed to physicians across the country. And today, in front of half the town, Harrison was presenting Clara and Elias with the official documentation. "It is my privilege," Harrison said, standing at a small podium outside the church, "to recognize Mrs. Clara Boone for her remarkable medical intervention in saving her husband's life. Though she lacks formal training, her actions demonstrated courage, skill, and a compassion that should serve as a model for all medical practitioners." He handed Clara a framed certificate signed by the Territorial Medical Board, acknowledging her contribution to medical knowledge. Clara took it with shaking hands, hardly able to believe what she was holding. Official recognition from the same system that had dismissed them both. The crowd applauded. Not everyone, but enough. Ben Crawford and his wife, the ranchers who'd stood with them, even Sheriff Donnelly, looking uncomfortable but present. Elias stood beside Clara, one arm around her waist, Hope balanced on his hip. Their daughter was almost a year old now, walking, babbling, fearless in the way children are when they know they're loved. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because the man I love was suffering, and no one else would help him." She looked at Elias, at the man who'd given her back herself. He's not broken. He never was. And I hope that anyone listening understands something important. Pain doesn't make people weak. Surviving it makes them strong. More applause. And this time, even some of the townspeople who'd whispered about her joined in. After the ceremony, as they walked back to their wagon, Thomas appeared. He looked terrible, thin, gray, older than his years. He stood at a distance, hat in his hands, his expression uncertain. Clara stopped, her hand tightening on Elias's arm. "Clara," Thomas said quietly, Could I speak with you?" Elias started to step forward, but Clara touched his shoulder. "It's all right." She walked to her brother, Hope still in Elias's arms, and waited. Thomas looked at her, then at Hope, then back at Clara. "I came to apologize. For everything. For the bet. For selling you. For—" His voice broke. "For being the worst kind of brother." Clara studied his face, seeing genuine regret there, but also seeing the years of damage that couldn't be undone with words. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I saw you up there. Saw them giving you that certificate, and I realized—" He swallowed hard. "I realized I threw away the best person in my life because I thought she was worthless. And I was wrong." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I forgive you, Thomas. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger hurts me more than it hurts you." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Is there a chance we could—" "No." Clara's voice was firm but not cruel. "I forgive you, but I don't trust you, and I won't let you near my family until you prove you've changed, if you ever do." Thomas nodded slowly, accepting the boundary. "Fair enough." He looked at Hope, managed a small smile. "She's beautiful. Looks like you." "She looks like herself." Clara turned back to where Elias waited. Goodbye, Thomas. Goodbye, Clara. She walked back to her husband and daughter and didn't look back. The ride home was quiet, peaceful. Hope fell asleep against Elias's chest, lulled by the wagon's movement. Clara sat beside them, the certificate in her lap, watching the Montana landscape roll past. You all right? Elias asked. I'm perfect. And she meant it. I have everything I need, everything I ever wanted. Even though you were sold for $50? Clara laughed. Especially because of that. Because it brought me to you. Best $50 ever spent, Elias agreed. They rode home through the golden afternoon, three people who'd been broken in different ways and had somehow pieced themselves back together into something whole, something strong. That night, after Hope was asleep and the cabin was quiet, Clara and Elias stood outside under a sky full of stars. The same stars that had watched them marry as strangers, that had seen them survive fire and cruelty and judgment. Stars that now saw them as they truly were, partners, parents, survivors. Tell me something, Elias said, pulling Clara close. If you could go back, change how we met, would you? Clara thought about it, about the humiliation and fear and shame of that first day, about all the pain that had led them here. No, she said finally, because all of it, the good and the terrible, made us who we are. And I wouldn't trade who we are for anything. Elias kissed her, slow and deep and full of promise. Neither would I. They stood there in the Montana night, holding each other, holding the life they'd built from ash and stubbornness and love. Clara Boone had been sold for $50 and married a man she didn't know. But she'd chosen to stay, chosen to fight, chosen to see what everyone else had missed, and in doing so she'd found something no amount of money could buy. She'd found home, she'd found family, she'd found herself, and she would never be lost again.